Hey everyone, welcome back to the Tom's Hardware Show. I'm Jared Walton, and today we are going to be talking about video encoding. Everything you need to know about video encoding. Actually, that's not entirely true because it's a huge topic and there are lots of ways of doing encoding. And a lot of people, they generally will do, if you're archiving videos, you're probably just going to do it offline. And it doesn't really matter how fast it is. If you want high quality, you take the time and just let it crunch in the background. I'm talking about GPU assisted video encoding for the most part. So we've got AMD, Intel, and Nvidia's latest. We've also got previous generation GPUs for comparisons as well. And I basically took 4 different videos and ran them through some encoding tests and then captured both their performance results as well as their quality results. And the quality results are calculated using VMAF, the Video Multimodal Functional Assessment. No, what is it? I don't know. It's made by Netflix. Basically, it's like an AI trained algorithm that you give it the source reference image, and then you get, not image, but video, and you give it the distorted video, it's called, and it will compare them, and it will tell you how close the distorted video is to the source material. So you can take something that was like a 50 megabit per second high quality video and compress it down to maybe, well, I don't know. It depends on what you're doing as far as your encoding algorithm, and it also depends on how much quality you're willing to lose. So the de facto standard for a long time has been H.264. H.264 came out with the Blu-ray era, HD DVD era, maybe. I think it was used in both. It's also referred to as the Advanced Video Codec, AVC. It was kind of the replacement for MPEG encoding. And so it handled higher bit rates and higher quality and all that stuff, higher resolutions. But it was also done, gosh, I don't know the exact date, I'd have to look it up, but it's been around for at least 10 to 15 years. In the intervening years, we've gone from 720p to 1080p to 4K, and now we're looking beyond 4K to even 8K monitors, right? And so how do you compress a video in order to stream at 8K? Well, you want the highest quality possible, which means you got to do more processing, which means you probably have to do something other than good old H.264. I mean, it's, today we wouldn't want to have an MPEG-2 encoded video at 4K. I don't know what the bit rate would need to be in order to be high quality, but it would be a lot. So I've got 4 videos that I did the testing on. Actually, it's 3 videos. One of them is Borderlands 3, and I re-encoded that video using FFmpeg down to a 1080p video. So it was a 4K source. I then did a super high quality encode at 1080p. So it's still like 40 megabits per second. The source is 100 megabits per second at 4K. And we're going to go through those performance results, the charts. And we've got 13 different GPUs, well, 12 GPUs and a CPU tossed in for good measure, using what I tried to create was ideal settings, but I don't know that ideal is the right word. I tried to create good settings. So I did specify a GOP size of 120, which means for a 60 frames per second video that you're going to get a keyframe every 2 seconds, which is what Twitch, yeah, I think Twitch recommends that. And so, should at least kind of level the playing field. Their defaults really didn't score that different. The GOP size, changing the GOP size to 120 helped AMD's GPUs the most, but it didn't help them a lot. It was like 5 to 10%. I want to say Nvidia's scores actually dropped slightly. Their default GOP size seemed to be about a keyframe every 4.5 to 5 seconds. And then on Intel, I don't know. I pulled up the details on the video files I had with the default encodings on Intel's Arc, and it had a keyframe at the start and nothing else. So I don't know what was going on there. Anyway, let's go ahead and we're going to hit the charts first, and then I've got some image quality comparisons at 1080p. And I know this is a live stream, so you're probably thinking, oh, like quality is like, how can you compare image quality through this live stream? That's probably re-encoding and doing lower image quality. But we'll see how it looks. You can go to the source article on Tom's Hardware, of course, and read all of this and see the full uncompressed images to get a better idea of what's going on. Let me actually drop that link into the chat here. And also, if my microphone starts bugging out and getting all staticky and distorted, just yell at me in the chat and tell me. It's been an issue that I have with, it's my old Yeti Blue microphone, and I don't know, sometimes it starts picking up a bunch of static, and if I unplug it, plug it back in, deal with a couple seconds of silence, it fixes it for a while. So I've got a new microphone that I'm going to switch to, but I didn't have time to get that done for today. All right, ready for the charts. Raise your hand if you are ready. I don't know. Is anyone watching? So Borderlands 3. And this is at 1080p, and we've got 3 bit rates that I target bit rates. Kind of for streaming purposes, live streaming. This is what I was mostly focused on because that's where GPU assisted encoding is most beneficial, I think. You know, you want to do an encode without taxing the CPU, without slowing down your gameplay if possible. And I said tune settings here because I did not use the defaults. I did specify a GOP size, but I basically gave it a bit rate of 3 megabits per second, or 6 megabits per second, or 8 megabits per second. And so we've got the 9 GPUs shown here. There's 2 more. Wait, that's 11 GPUs shown here, plus, well, 10 GPUs in the CPU. And then the RTX 2080 Ti and RTX 1080 Ti, I removed from the line charts because the 1080 Ti quality was identical to the GTX 1650, and the 2080 Ti quality was virtually identical to the 3090. I say virtually because on the H.264 encoding, I guess Nvidia's hardware does like a, what would you call it? Like a randomization a bit. Like it's not a, you don't get the exact same H.264 output every time you encode on Nvidia's hardware, at least for H.264. I believe the HEVC encoding was identical between the 2080 Ti and the 3090. And the same goes for like 3050 or 2060. Like they're all basically the same video engine, NVEnc hardware. And so you've got, for NVIDIA, you've got Turing, which is the GTX 16 series and the 20 series. But the 1650 is actually a Pascal encoder. So that covers the 10 series as well. Then the 3090 and Turing are very, very, very similar. I think they're pretty much the same. And then the 4090 is new. So that's the Nvidia side. From AMD, the quality hasn't changed a lot. From 590 to Vega to RDNA and the 5700. The exception there is the RDNA 2 did improve quality some, I believe, on the lower bitrate stuff. It looks like it virtually overlaps or underlaps the RX 7900 XTX though. So that's kind of where we sit. And you can see like a good result is 80. An excellent result, like near perfect, would be 100. So anything above 90 is really good, and people aren't going to complain about like blockiness or quality, generally speaking. 80 is good. There's some artifacting, but especially if you were watching it on a TV, which is kind of what VMAF was made to approximate, it would still be considered good quality. And you can see at 3 megabits per second, we're dealing with more like fair quality, down to the 40 range is poor quality, and then 20 is considered bad. I don't think they had a 0 score. Like it's, I don't know, can you score below? Somehow you can score below 20, but the categories were, you know, bad, poor, fair, good, and excellent. That's from the VAMF guidelines. As you ramp up the bit rates at 1080p, by the time you're at 8 megabits per second, we're getting into the good range. Halfway between good and excellent, maybe. Like the best scoring card was the 4090 for H.264. But it's still, like, we'll get to the images here in a second. It still has some definite loss of quality. So if you're sitting at a computer screen and you're 2 feet away from it, it's more noticeable than if you're watching it on a TV from 10 feet away. All right, let's go to the next slide here. This is HEVC, and you can see how much quality jumped. Like the minimum, even at 3 megabits per second, went from 45 on AMD now up into the 65 range. But AMD is still quite a bit behind the other contenders, where like the CPU with lib X264, that got about 70. Then Nvidia's cards range from about 73 up to 76 or so. The Arc A770 was the top performer for HEVC. Interesting. And then AV1, the quality is actually very similar. So if but of course, there's only 4 things that can do AV1 right now. You've got Nvidia's 40 series, you've got AMD's 7900 series or 7000 series. There will be more of those in the future. Arc GPUs, and then you've got CPU encoding. And there's multiple CPU encoders that can do AV1. I used lib AV1 SVT, I think it's called. And so this is the AV1 encoding. And you can see if I flip back and forth from HEVC to AV1, the lines on average go up a little bit with AV1, I think. AMD, you know, their 7900, it increases slightly. The 4090 increases slightly. Arc actually decreases a bit. And the CPU increases slightly. Actually, the CPU got a pretty good bump at the 3 megabits per second range. So that's what the the quality looks like. So now at the top end of the scale, 8 megabits per second, we're getting cards that are doing 90 and above, which, you know, it's not perfect, but it's pretty dang good. So, and we'll see how this looks on the YouTube stream or whatever stream you're looking at. This should be 1080p. You know, the text in the top right corner is mostly legible on my end, but it's actually still, even at 40 megabits per second, it's a little bit fuzzy. Possibly because I downsized 4K video initially to create my reference video. You can see the grass blades. You can see, you know, a little bit of texture on the rocks. You can see in the trees, like the viney textures or whatever. Now, this we'll hit these CPU first. And I've only got X264 and AV1. I didn't want to, like, do a ton of different images. You can see how much the CPU, even with AV1, lost quite a bit of quality, and that's because we're at 3 megabits per second. This was like the worst case scenario. AV1 though brings back a lot of the detail. Like, you can't see the grass totally, but there's more hints of grass rather than just being kind of a greenish blob. Here's the reference. No. Oh. What am I? Okay, yeah. Sorry. Reference again. And then this is AMD. And AMD's, even with their latest and greatest RDNA 3 chips, like, their video encoder leaves a lot to be desired, especially with H.264. Like, there's even distortion, like you see things shift because it's doing frame-to-frame interpolations. When you go to AV1, things get better, but they're not like here's the reference, here's AV1. Like, it's still not perfect at all. It's the worst of the encoders by a decent margin, like 10 points maybe in some cases, especially at 3 megabits per second. Then the Arc H.264, still a lot of loss of quality. AV1 does better. Still can't fully see the grass blades, but they're there kind of. And then finally we have Nvidia H.264 and AV1, you know, and Nvidia got, like, I think the highest score on AV1 for 3 megabits per second, and yet it still doesn't look that great. So, you know, there's only so much you can do with limited bandwidth, but if you were live streaming this and watching, an AV1 stream at 3 megabits per second is probably pretty close to like a 6 to 8 megabits per second H.264 stream. So that's as far as I went with our comparisons on the image quality, because capturing the individual frames at the exact same spot and sorting through them takes time. So I'm not going to do that for any of the other things. You'll just have to trust my numbers here. So now we move up to 4K. Bumped up the encoding bit rate. So our minimum is now 8 megabits per second. Then we have 12 megabits in the middle and 16 megabits, at the end. And you can see, like, AMD, their older cards, the 590, which is pretty much totally obscured by the Vega, and the 5700 XT, those are all like almost identical in terms of quality. The 6900, it's actually underneath the red. They have, I believe, the identical result. So you can't see the green at all, but it is there. And then Nvidia, you know, they ranked above the CPU for, you know, the lib SVT encoder at medium quality, or I think I did slow quality on H.264, and then I did I think a preset of 3 or 5 on the AV1 stuff for the CPU. Let's see. And then at the top, like, the best result, Arc got the best result at 4K. The 4090 by the top of it is basically tied with it. The UHD 770, that's the integrated graphics on the 13900K CPU. Pretty close in terms of quality to the 4090. We'll get to performance after all the quality stuff here. So AMD has made improvements in their H.264 with their latest RDNA 3. It's not an exceptional boost, especially at the top, because the more important thing is to shift over to a modern codec. So HEVC, AV1 is very close to this. Again, I think Nvidia got the biggest benefit from AV1, whereas Intel still favors their HEVC in terms of quality. And performance, I think, was faster on AV1 for Nvidia and Intel, but we'll get to that in a bit and check that out. So now with AV1, you know, with HEVC, and AMD's older cards are, you know, at the bottom. Interestingly to see that the red 7900 XT actually is below some of the newer cards, some of the older cards. So like Vega looks like was their top for HEVC quality. I'm kind of curious to see that. 590 actually still also ties or places slightly ahead of the 7900, but that's because AMD maybe put more of their budget into AV1, which is what the final chart is. So you can see the red line, the red dashed line for the 7900 XT goes from, you know, a minimum of 67 or something up to about 84, maybe 83. Whereas with AV1, it goes from about 71 up to 86 or so. The CPU and Intel and AMD AV1 results are all very close together. In practice, you probably wouldn't even notice the difference. Whereas Nvidia's 4090 hardware, the Ada Lovelace architecture, that ends up being slightly better. Borderlands 3, I guess I use the benchmark sequence from these games because that's easy and you can capture it and not worry too much about doing other stuff. It does maybe have a little bit more movement and flashing. I had someone ask in our comments on the article, like, why didn't you use other video sources? And it's like, well, honestly, the hardest thing is trying to get good quality sources. So my source material was 100 megabits per second 4K captures using Nvidia's Shadowplay. And it's like, well, try and get even a 50 megabits per second capture at 4K for most movies. And it's like, yeah, you could probably rip a modern Blu-ray disc, but guess what? I don't have a Blu-ray drive anymore. I haven't used optical in, gosh, I can't remember the last time I watched a movie off of Blu-ray or DVD. It's probably been at least 6 or 7 years. So, you know, I looked for downloads and they would all be things like, oh, it's encoded at 8 megabits per second or 12 megabits per second, but, you know, doing a re-encode of 12 megabits per second to 16 megabits per second doesn't really tell you anything. So that's why I used gaming material. Maybe if I had a good video camera, I could wander around. Actually, movies don't tend to move even as much as games, so I think your quality might be a little higher in a lot of cases. And this is 60 FPS, whereas, you know, movies would often be 30 frames per second, which then means they can put more bitrate per frame and improve the quality that way. All right, 4090 at the top. Let's go on Far Cry. If I flip back just to show you, let's see. This is slide 20, so I think if I go to slide 17, this is the same thing for Borderlands 3, and you can see how everything dropped on Borderlands 3. So, you know, the Far Cry 6 sequence, I guess less movement or less difficulty in encoding, so the quality improved a little bit. Doesn't really change the standings much. So we've got H.264, H.265, HEVC. Things get a lot closer. Again, you know, it's kind of interesting how the 6900 XT is worst at HEVC for AMD. I don't know why, just the way it happened. And I think it overlaps the 5700 XT. The gray is right next to the green. So, you know, they went downhill on HEVC quality slightly, at least with FFmpeg encoding. You know, you gotta take that with a grain of salt, because AMD, I talked to them and they said, oh, we can confirm your results are correct, but we've submitted fixes to the FFmpeg community and those should be rolled in. I don't know how much the fixes are going to do though. Like, are we talking fixes that will boost their scores in VMAF by 10 points or 5 points? Or is it going to be like, oh, the score's improved by 1 point? Anything would be nice, but you know, they're definitely lower quality encoding right now. Even with AV1. AV1 here, actually, they basically batch the Arc, so that's pretty good with Nvidia at the top. And the CPU-based encoding that I used, the settings I used, ended up being just a touch lower than the others. And then last we have Watch Dogs Legion, and I said this with the Far Cry 6, like, so here's Watch Dogs, here's Far Cry 6. So again, you see like everything shifts up. I guess the Watch Dogs Legion benchmark sequence is yet again easier to encode and get good quality than Far Cry 6, which was easier than Borderlands 3. Source material matters. Standings though, they don't really get affected much. It's the same story, so we'll quickly go through these. Everything starts clumping together under HEVC, and then we have the AV1 finally, which is pretty much the same old story. I mean, like Watch Dogs Legion at 4K with the 16 megabits per second and AV1 on the Nvidia card, it's very, very close to the source material. You know, scores like 95 or 96 even. I think it's 95. And in motion, there's maybe minor differences, but generally speaking, it looks pretty good. All right, so that takes care of the quality then there's the performance side of things, and I want to discuss this a little bit more. So you have presets in FFmpeg and other encoders too. You can try and specify like quality versus speed of encoding. You know, with live streaming, you want it to encode at 60 frames per second minimum if you're doing a 60 frames per second stream. Anything more than that is kind of like gravy. Like, does it really matter that RTX 4090 is getting nearly 500 frames per second on encoding? Not for live streaming, but if you were, archiving videos and you didn't care about like maximum quality, you just wanted to do it fast, you could potentially use GPUs to crank through them really quickly. There's quality presets though, and so Nvidia's default is P4 out of P7, so they can go from, I think, P1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I tried P7. The quality in VMAF went up like 1 point, maybe half a point. The encoding speed went from 490 down to like 200 something at 1080p. So minuscule gain in quality for about half the throughput. That same thing happens with AMD. Their default encoding choice for FFmpeg is listed as speed. They have 3 quality presets: speed, balanced, and quality. So speed and balanced produced nearly the same FPS. Balanced was like a few points higher, and then quality was like half a point to 1 point higher, but half the encoding performance. So I decided not to test with the maximum quality just because the gains were so minimal, whereas the speed loss was pretty significant. There's basically like the fast stuff, everything from like GTX 1080 Ti, like the 1080 Ti and the 1650, they have the exact same quality results, but I guess the 1650's engine is clocked a bit higher. The 3090 and 2080 Ti are basically tied. Maybe the 3090's video engine is clocked just a tiny bit slower. And then the 4090, was the fastest. AMD's results, I think if you opt for the speed over balance, that they might have even gotten closer to 500 frames per second at 1080p, but it was like 5 points lower on quality, so it was kind of a big drop, and so that's why I didn't use it. Older generation hardware, like, it's kind of weird where you see like, why was the 6900 XT slower than its predecessor? Why is Vega and 590 so different? That's a pretty big jump. The 13900K, I mean, that's a pretty beastly CPU, but for H.264 encoding, it's actually using a medium, or no, using the slow preset. It's plugging along at over 240 frames per second. This is for AVC or H.264. If we go to HEVC next, big drop in performance on some of the cards, faster on others. So like, look, the 590 and the Vega actually got faster because those were made in an era where people were thinking HEVC would displace H.264. And then it didn't happen because HEVC, they were really being sticklers about enforcing royalties. And so people actually, not people, but companies said, we're not going to use HEVC. We think H.264 is good enough. And H.264 was practically free for all intents and purposes. Like, you didn't have to pay royalties unless there were, like, I think Blu-ray players did, maybe movie makers did, but a lot of the software could do it for free. And so that's why it became ubiquitous. AV1 wants to repeat what happened with H.264 and be ubiquitous. There's lawsuits going on. Who knows what's going to happen? But this is why, like, older generation cards got faster doing HEVC than they did with H.264. Newer generation, though, like, most of them get slower. Just going back and forth there. Like, the 1650 got faster, so the Pascal era got faster with HEVC. Intel still on Arc, they got faster with HEVC, but the UHD770, their XE discrete graphics 1 DG1 from well, I mean, this is integrated, so it's the XE-LP that you find in Tiger Lake and Rocket Lake, as well as now Alder Lake and Raptor Lake. Did I say? Yeah, Rocket Lake, Raptor Lake. Okay, so still got 60 frames per second, but it wasn't nearly as fast as it was in H.264. And then AMD, I think AMD, their older ones. So the 5700 got fast. No, it stayed the same. The 6900 XT stayed the same, and the 7900 gets a little bit slower. Then we go to AV1, and you can see like there's only so few cards that support this. That performance on those was pretty good. They're all the AMD and AMD and Nvidia are pushing nearly 500 frames per second at 1080p. Arc was a little bit slower at 450-ish, 440. And then the CPU, I think, you know, there's ways to customize AV1 encoding to make it more demanding, especially on CPU. But the CPU for 13900K ripping along at 200 frames per second. 4K. So I've got all the results at 4K for the 3 games, but let's just focus on Borderlands, because let me show you, like, this is Borderlands H.264. This is Far Cry H.264, and this is Watch Dogs Legion's H.264, and you can see like there's almost no change in how the charts look. So, you know, performance stayed very consistent across the sample videos, the 3 videos at 4K. So we only really need to deal with the Borderlands performance to cover all of them. You need at least a 13900K or a GPU made within the past 4 years-ish. I guess, well, AMD GPUs of the 5000 series and later, or Nvidia GPUs of the Pascal era or later. They can all do 60 frames per second encoding at 4K with H.264 and also with HEVC. The CPU takes a huge hit in HEVC, which is weird because if you go back to, or if we go on to AV1, the CPU in AV1 encoding, 78 frames per second, worst case at 16 megabits. That's actually the same score it got for 16 megabits H.264. So modern codec, I think it's more heavily threaded or threadable. So their performance with H.264 and AV1 improved or stayed the same. But HEVC was quite demanding on the CPU. And then finally the AV1. So AV1, AMD ripped through it at 4K at 200 frames per second. They were the fastest. And again, given that they were also the worst quality of AV1, sacrificing some speed in order to boost performance would not be a bad thing to do. Hopefully that's what they're working with FFmpeg to implement in the code, and those changes may be forthcoming. I think they've said they've submitted it. How long will it take for those changes to actually show up in the publicly available code is not clear. So we'll see how that goes. And let's see. That takes us through everything. So again, like if I skip to Watch Dogs Legion, oh, that's interesting. There might be some margin of error. Who knows? Like the CPU speed on the 16 megabits per second dropped quite a bit. But there's a ton of data. Like this is hours and hours of testing via scripts, thankfully. But here's the summary chart. Oh, that's not the chart that I want. Here's the summary chart. I'll leave that up and talk. Sorry, and talk for a minute. So you can see all the benchmarks and results. I only did to 2 decimal places showing on VMAF, but it does go out to 6 decimals. And like, if I looked at the the GTX 1080 Ti and the 1650, for example, all of those columns are literally identical out to 6 decimal places. So with the Pascal era, Nvidia didn't do any like, I don't know what you would call it, like randomization of their sampling patterns in order to improve the quality. But then they started doing that a little bit with the Turing and Pascal, so there's like minor differences. I think actually Turing and Pascal, sorry, I'm saying Turing and Pascal, Turing and Ampere, so the 2080 Ti and the 3090. Their HEVC results were identical, but their H.264 results are not. I don't know why. And then the 4090 Ada, you know, it has slightly different sampling patterns or whatever compared to the 3090. So, you know, it doesn't have identical results, but they're pretty much the same. Intel, you know, Arc did improve the quality on their encoding for both HEVC and H.264, and AV1 was new. Intel actually, it's interesting because they've got this thing called Deep Link where you can, like on a laptop or desktop, I think on a desktop with both Arc and UHD graphics, that you can try and use both of them to help encode faster. But that kind of seems like a weird thing to do because the quality of the encoding on Arc is better. I could be mistaken that. I think there's a way to tell their Deep Link to decode with UHD and encode with Arc is kind of what you would do, because the decoding hasn't improved. And so if you're re-encoding something, you can have the UHD decode it and then the Arc encode it for the best in quality and the best in performance. And then if we look at the AMD results, I'm trying to think which ones were identical. I thought there were two columns that were the same here. I'm just looking at them quick. Maybe they were just really close. Yeah, I mean, I don't see any scores that are the same between the two columns, any of the two columns. So, you know, there's minor variations between 590 and Vega and RDNA 1, RDNA 2, and RDNA 3. Actually, oh no, that's what it is. RDNA 3 and RDNA 2 have identical H.264 results. They don't have the same HEVC results, but they were the same on H.264. So, like if you look at HEVC, they actually kind of walked back a quality loss compared to like the 590 and the Vega series were the best. Then it dropped with RDNA with their, what's it called, the ACE or VCE or something, video coding engine. And then they walked back and improved quality a little bit with RDNA 3, but it's still not quite up to the same level as Vega, which was their high watermark. So interesting. And then I had this other slide, which this one's coded in colors, a little bit of an eyesore, but what you're looking here for is this is compared to the fastest or best quality of each category. And so if you look, you can see that for pure speed, the 7900 XTX was the fastest at 4K across the board. The 4090 was nearly tied with it most of the time, but there were occasions like at the 4K 8 megabit and 12 megabit, it's a little bit slower than AMD. But then on the quality side, or sorry, I'm looking at the quality side for VMAF. So on the VMAF quality, the 4090 almost universally wins at 4K. It was a little bit worse than the Arc, but its performance wasn't as good as AMD's. Performance at 1080p, the 4090 was fastest, which is kind of like, I don't know why it needed to be that fast and why it doesn't scale as well as AMD's did. But and then the quality, 4090 quality at 1080p was mostly top of the class. Like there's a few cases where the Arc beats it or ties it. Yeah. So look for green. Green is good, red is bad. Intel's UHD, very slow on the encoding FPS. 590, also very slow on the encoding speed. But on quality, you can see like most of the red for quality, red and yellow, is falling in the AMD columns, especially on H.264 with lower bit rates. And they did improve those low bit rate scores, going from like I guess it's from the RDNA 1 to RDNA 2. They boosted their low bit rate scores a little bit on HEVC or on H.264. All right, that's it. You guys are being quiet in chat. I don't see any comments. I guess it's like 12 bots watching me. You got any questions, comments, concerns? I will ask this, like, if you've got a comment and you want to say, Jared, you screwed up and you need to use this command to get much higher quality, I would love to hear it, because I asked the community. I was over on Reddit talking on the FFmpeg subreddit and saying, hey, you know, what should I do? And that's where I got, like, one of the guys said, hey, one of the people said, hey, you should use -G120 in order to specify the keyframe interval, because that keeps things more consistent. I think there's also, like, if you don't have keyframes every 2 seconds, it's not the end of the world. But if you're creating video that you might want to watch on other devices, it's good to have a more regular keyframe interval, because you don't want to have things where it's like you try and seek in the video. And I've seen this before, where you get a video and you're like, hey, I want to skip forward a minute, and you try and do that, and it just like hangs or goes really slow, or even crashes in some cases. That's usually by doing weird things with the encoding. Like, there's things that are allowed in the various video codecs that are frowned upon. So one of them is, like, your frames are supposed to come in order, and in some cases, like, so you have a keyframe and a keyframe. Let's put my arms here, and you can reference with in some cases you can have an interpolated frame that's between these two that actually references a frame that's in the future outside of this block. And it's like, in theory it should work. In practice, though, that can screw things up. So, you know, the encoding people are like, don't do that. Like, that just breaks compatibility, because there's a lot of devices that don't want to implement the crazier aspects of the spec. And so they're like, oh, we only support up to main 10 or whatever variant of H.264, HEVC, whatever you're talking about. So anyway, I asked them for some feedback on settings to use, and I tried to use those. I tuned AMD a little bit, so they lost a little bit of performance on FPS and gained quality, because I went with the balanced preset instead of their default speed preset. Nvidia, if you drop to their speed preset, it also boosted their encoding performance a bit and lost a bit of quality. I don't think they lost that much quality. It was like a couple of points. Intel, same thing. You could trade speed for quality or quality for speed, but it wasn't a huge difference. Like, most of them, going from their worst quality preset to their best quality preset, it only improved quality on the range of like 5 to 10% overall, I would say. Whereas the performance could drop to a half or even a third, maybe. If you're doing CPU encoding, those same like things, those presets can make a much bigger difference on speeds and time to encode, and the quality can improve more. Like, I know some people are saying, what is it? There's an AV1 dash, I don't think it's AOL, but AOM maybe? AV1 AOM. That's a different codec than what I tested with. My understanding is their quality is potentially better for CPU encoding, but their performance for AV1 is worse. Like, instead of getting where I was getting 100 to 200 frames per second, like, it's getting more like in the 20 to 30 frames per second range. So there are lots of CPU software alternative codecs out there, But if you're using QuickSync from Intel or NVInc from Nvidia or I don't know what AMD's is called. It's their AMF is what their codecs are labeled in FFmpeg. But those seem to have far fewer options and customization available than what you would get from the software encoders. Nvidia probably has the most flags or parameters that you can set. AMD has quite a few, but a lot of them didn't seem to help me. And then Intel Arc, especially on AV1, it was really restricted in what you could tell it to do. And I was like, oh, I guess I'll just stick with the defaults except for GOP size. All right. That's it. Hope you enjoyed that. Bottom line, like this again isn't necessarily for archival purposes, but for live streaming. And you can see like Intel and Nvidia, their AV1 performance and quality was better than AMD's. Sorry, their quality was better than AMD's. Their performance was good enough. I mean, like, they're both doing over 120 frames per second at 4K. I don't think anyone is streaming at faster than that. Maybe in the future when we're doing 8K streaming, it will matter more, but by then we'll be on to a couple of generations later hardware, and so things may change. Anyway, that's about it. No questions today, so I will just go ahead and sign off, people. Thanks for watching.